I'm Carrie Brown, and I'm the Executive Director of the Alumnae Association, and I always say that one of the toughest parts of my job is interrupting all these good conversations at alumni events, and this is no different. It's a pleasure to welcome you all back to Smith. Thank you for being here. It's great to see so many familiar faces and so many new friends. I hope you found this morning's lectures as stimulating and thought-provoking as you hoped you would. What could be better than being back in class with your favorite professors with no tests and no papers? I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our faculty members, Pat Scarda, Ellen Watson, Manaz Badavi, John Davis, Tom Litwin, Susan Van Dyne, Sam Intrader, Don Siegel, Elizabeth Meyerson, and Martin Antonetti. Thank you all so much for your time and your expertise. And you can tell the students at Smith feel no differently about their professors today than you did when you were here, for good reason. It's now my honor to introduce Sherley Young, class of 1961. Sherley graduated from Smith with a BA in history. She spent her junior year in Paris studying, and I do not speak French, so somebody else is going to have to say this. She received her MS in education from the University of Pennsylvania in 1967. Shirley taught at 5 independent schools on the East Coast, was a trust officer at Citibank, founded 2 nonprofit women's health facilities, an abortion clinic which opened 5 months after Roe versus Wade in 1973, and a birth center in 1978, which is the oldest continually operational birth center in the United States. She is a volunteer leader for Habitat for Humanity International, having led 12 trips in 10 years. And that's where we've really gotten to know her best in the last few years, because she's been kind enough to lead many Smith alumni on these trips. Her talk will follow the thread of empowerment, which in hindsight has run throughout her diverse career. Sherley.
I don't have much of a voice right now, so can you hear me? Well, I feel like I have such a great fan club here that it's very easy to speak, having so many of my classmates. And I'm a rule breaker, and the rule I'm going to break now is I'm going to read my talk, otherwise I'll talk too much. So, first I want to thank Liz Bigwood, of the head of Smith Travel, for suggesting that I be the speaker today. I look around the room and see many of my classmates who've had equally fascinating journeys. But here I am, and I've had a very good time thinking about the how, the why, and the where of my journey. It has been an opportunistic career. I did not set out to do what I've ended up doing, but I've loved the serendipity of it. And the underlying theme of it was empowerment. And certainly Sophia Smith thought about empowerment by starting the college, so it seems very fitting. I can't stand untapped potential. And initially I started teaching girls, because there's 600 million of undereducated women in the world right now. And I love to educate, as in educate. I'm not good in Latin, but the leading out of, again, the unfurling of the potential, which is what I think education's about. And I've always been an iconoclast and a contrarian. Over the years, I've taught girls, I've taught the public about women's rights by starting and running an abortion clinic and a birth center, taught and advocated for learning different students, led global village trips, and joined the board of a new high school in Tanzania for vulnerable girls, and corralled 2 of my classmates to be on the board as well. The springboard for this journey was my good fortune to have a very loving family, one great school after another, wonderful health, abundance of energy, and coming of age on the cusp of the women's movement. My primary school was a Renaissance school run by an Italian, Miss Caterina Zara. And I was in a class of 9, which was fortunate since my dearest friend and I were both learning different. I was off the wall with energy. She was off the wall with being outrageous. And no teacher tried to fit us into round holes. Instead, they let me run all the errands and let me sub in other classes' plays, anything to get me out of the classroom so they could teach. But my mother fondly called me her case of St. Vitus dance. But what luck that I wasn't pigeonholed as being ADD and dyslexic. I then went to Chatham Hall, a boarding school in Southern Virginia, a wise choice on the part of my parents. In those days, the parents made all the decisions. They knew that by putting everything on one campus, I could do it all. And I played sports and wrote in the school newspaper and acted and studied very hard. And no one said I needed special help, although my English teacher pulled her hair out with my term papers, but thought I was a brilliant conversationalist, especially about current literature, not realizing that all I did is read the New York Times book review section from cover to cover. Smith allowed me to be an individual. Here are some of the examples. Mr. Van Voorhis was very bemused in English 1-1 that met at 9 a.m. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, because I often appeared in mismatched shoes as a result of no light in the closet, sharing a closet with a roommate that didn't have a 9 o'clock course. Or seeing me ride my bike with books in one hand and an umbrella in another. That's what knees are for. Then sophomore year, I stormed a college hall because I was outraged that we had 10 overnights. That was all we were allowed per semester, and I was determined that that wouldn't be visited upon the next class. And the way I got people to come with me was I posted things on the back of the doors of the toilets in the library, kind of a captive audience. And we succeeded. That regulation was taken away. Joining junior year abroad was the same thing. I just decided after freshman year that I couldn't bear to spend a whole year on French grammar. There were too many other courses I wanted to take, so I thought, well, I won't go. And come spring, I looked around and all my friends were going one place to another, so I went back to College Hall and said, I want to go, and I'm going to be a history major in Paris. Don't tell me there isn't good history in Paris. And by the way, I'll take grammar at Penn in the summer. And they said, okay. But that's what I love about Smith, is that, they really did let you do that kind of thing. So I spend a paragraph now talking, what makes us Smithies? Why is it that so many people say, oh, I know you went to Smith, or, I can spot a Smithy on a train.
Just pull it down a little, it'll be fine.
Okay. I was talking to a Smith professor who's a current professor here, and he said the Smith students were the hardest students to teach, but the most rewarding. And I find that a lot of my very close Smith friends are learning different like I am. So do they just take risks and take more of us than usual? I think Smith nurtures their students. I remember taking Cecilia Kenyon's Government 323, where the 21st century education meeting was today. And she was outraged that I wrote a terrible paper having aced her first test. So she hauled me into her office and said she wouldn't accept this drivel, and I burst into tears and recited all the books I'd read. And she paused for a moment and she said, for God's sake, Shirley, get a ghostwriter. So maybe it's because I'm mildly learning different, or was marginalized as a trailing sister to a charming brother, that I have empathy. And when I was small, like so many children, I was adamant on things being fair. Have I taken this legacy of fairness to provide avenues of choice for others? As graduation approached, I couldn't think of anything I wanted to do for 50 weeks of the year. 36 sounded great, so I backed into teaching. I knew I loved history, and of course I ended up loving students. I taught in all-girls schools and found that engaging the students was the best part. And it was a pretty heady experience to motivate the students to find and trust their own authority. After a few years of teaching, I took night courses at Penn to get my MS in Ed. Penn in those days is not what it is today, and the standards were way lower than what I was used to at Smith. I, the writer of nightmare papers, kept getting A's by rolling in the paper into the typewriter, no first drafts. So that gives you an idea. I was not challenged, and I was outraged that the professors would ask the men in the class if they were interested in job offers that the professors had received, and only after that would ask the women if we were interested. Obviously, I'd been spoiled by all-girls education. In 1964, I thought I had a bun growing on the back of my head being a schoolmarm, so I decided I'd tackle New York, that it wouldn't tackle me. And I thought I'd go into publishing because I like to read. But finding salaries in publishing companies wouldn't support living alone, and I'd had 10 years of roommates. I decided I'd call on banks and ended up at Citibank, which was with one of the most friendly female banks, friendly to women at that time. They started me at the lowest salary level because they said there was no correlation between teaching and banking, and after 6 weeks I went back and said, there's direct correlation. In banking, you can't sell your services till you've won over your clients. And in teaching, you can't teach till you've won over your students. Well, we'd graduated at a time when the Fortune 500 solicited us. I remember them coming to campus to recruit us, Xerox and IBM, and so I never thought of the downside risk of speaking my mind and losing my job. Thought there were other ones out there if I had to do that. What a change from the world today. My oldest is looking for the next step in her career, so if you're hiring anybody, come speak to me afterwards. I loved my time at bank, and of course I didn't stay mute. In fact, they didn't give me an exit interview because they knew what I thought already. And the last day I wore my husband's three-piece suit because I said that was the only way you were going to get ahead in the world. So I went back to teaching, practically being shunned for having sullied my hands in business. But simultaneously, they wanted me to teach economics. I said I wouldn't teach Samuelson, but I taught an elective course where I taught them how to read a proxy statement and an annual report and fill out a 1040 form. This was at the Brearley School in New York City, and most of the parents were in finance and were thrilled that their daughters would pipe up at dinner with something intelligent to say. Then we moved back to my hometown, Philadelphia. My Hungarian husband was obviously looking for roots, mine. We had our first child, and I loved motherhood. I baked bread and sewed and volunteered, and was on the board of both Planned Parenthood of Southeast Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic region. A good friend of mine and I went to Penn and went to the health services and said that we thought they should provide birth control for the women students. And they said they weren't interested in preventive medicine. So we went to the dean of students and said, was she interested? Oh, she thought, oh my God, it would be heavenly not to have so many tearful pregnant students come. So she said we could teach a birth control, but to men and women separately. So we did. And meanwhile, we went back to Planned Parenthood and said, look, I think Planned Parenthood should open a clinic in West Philadelphia to service the Penn students. So we found a place and we're just about ready to sign a lease when we went back to Penn's health service and said, well, we're going to, be next door to you. And they relented and started providing birth control for their students. Roe v. Wade was coming up in January of 1973, and I was getting restless. I found volunteer work. I was always the tail of the dog. For a mother with a child, it was very unpredictable. She never knew whether I was going to be there every week or away every day. So I thought if I got a part-time job, it would create more security for her. So I remember the first meeting of Planned Parenthood after Roe v. Wade, and I stood up and said, we've been blamed for doing abortions all these years, so let's do them. No was the answer. So at that point, a doctor who was a friend, we had a mutual friend in common, came to me and said, would I help him start a first trimester nonprofit birth center? No, we did that later. Abortion clinic with him. And I did. And it was the perfect job for me because as the clinic grew and my job grew, I just hired somebody and delegated so that I could regulate how much time I could spend with my children. And it was a fascinating roller coaster for 22 years. Talk about empowerment. I don't know whether I empowered the patients or the staff more. We never turned a woman away for lack of funds. I'd interview them, we'd loan them the money, and we had a 90% collection rate. We were situated in the western suburbs to be convenient for women who lived beyond the Philadelphia area where there were a couple clinics. For 9 years, everything was peaceful. Women asked their doctors or friends where they could have an abortion, and all we had to do was provide a safe, affordable, accessible service. But in 1982, the anti-choice faction started harassing our patients. In 1984, we arrested 493 people who invaded the clinic, with the support of several state legislators rallying them on outside. And the whole climate changed. The women began to creep in a corner to read in the yellow pages where they could get an abortion because they didn't dare tell their friends or their doctors because of the anti-choice climate. Protesters came daily and yelled at me. They said, God will punish me. I said, she's listening to me. And by the time I closed the clinic in 1995, a bullet had come through the window one night where had I been seated, it would have hit me. The doctors' houses and offices were picketed. One teacher told my young daughter, caught a little boy telling my young daughter that her mother was a baby killer. And we had arrested 1,988 protesters over all those years. People used to ask me, how could I do abortions for 22 years? How could I be involved? And one of the reasons was it was so often a watershed experience for these women. For once, they were captain of their souls instead of victims of circumstance, that they, not time, made the decision. And we always did counseling one-on-one with master-level counselors who made sure that they explored the options that women had, that particular woman had for this particular pregnancy and made sure that she wasn't coerced. And I remember several times being in the procedure room with the doctor when the woman would say, "I've decided to go full term." And we were thrilled and very supportive of her because, again, she'd made the decision. Let's see. But besides these, it was really fascinating to be in the procedure room with these women because they were not under anesthesia. The doctor said the counselors was his anesthesia, that if the counseling had been done well, the women would do well in the procedure room, and they did. But you could just see them recognize their own strength as having gone through this process. And likewise, my staff grew. In 1973, women in suburbia didn't work. In fact, people asked me if I was getting divorced or if my husband had lost his job that I was working. I said no, but it was cheaper than psychiatry, and that was the option. And staffing the clinic, I considered the clinic often a kind of halfway house for women who were entering or re-entering the work world. They had a heck of a time finding childcare. There were no daycare centers in the 70s, and they would cobble together whatever they could to make it work, because we all know we're as happy as our children are happy. So having good childcare was very important. But they grew like weeds too, and my graduates would go on to be nurses and social workers, and one became a doctor, one became a director of a domestic abuse program. So that was very exciting to see these women find their potential. Then the patients often thanked me so profusely that I began to think, when is there a time for women that need the same sort of compassionate care? And I thought, childbirth. So that began the gestation period of starting the birth center. It took 48 months. There's no mammal that has that long. And when I finally opened it, it really took my belief in zero population growth and self-control not to have a third child in the birth center, because it really is a wonderful way to have a baby. And I started it with the same physician that ran the clinic with me. He was a true psychological adult. My definition of a psychological adult is someone whose sense of self comes from within. And boy, he needed that, because his doctor friends were furious. They were glad for him to do their dirty work in doing safe abortions, but for him to support midwives who were taking away their bread and butter was not cricket. And the birth center was very hard to start. One, I started it in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, the hotbed of conservatism. I used to mutter under my breath and say, if I can start one here, I can start one anywhere. Secondly, doctors weren't referring to us, obviously, and there were no satisfied women because it took 9 months to be satisfied, and we were just beginning. And so I had no money for marketing. I remember calling up in snowstorms. I'd call up the radio stations and cancel a bogus childbirth class just to get the name out. And then we had difficulty with cash flow for the same reason. You just give care to this woman from about the 3rd month of pregnancy till birth, and then the insurance companies didn't want to pay for out-of-hospital birth. I kept telling them it's safer and 1/3 the cost. And my friend said, oh, you won't have any trouble starting a birth center. Foundations will love you. Foundations love you with a track record. I got my first grant after 2 years of giving birth to babies. So some of the staff even deferred their salary, and we hung on by our fingernails. But it was so buoyed up by the satisfaction that these families had by giving birth in a natural, having birth be a natural event instead of a medical event. A minor blip was that the anti-choice people found out that we were running an abortion clinic and a birth center, so they called the doctor and me schizophrenic murderers. It's my favorite handle. No, but we were empowering women, giving them the ability to make good choices. In the early 90s, my children were growing up, and I'd always said I'd go back to traditional teaching. I've been teaching the public with an abortion clinic and a birth center. But after 30 years, let me tell you, teaching had changed dramatically. Parents were in your face, micromanaging with a sense of entitlement, and advanced placement courses were controlling how you taught. You could no longer follow the passion of the class being interested in one thing. So I ended up teaching at a wonderful new Quaker school called Delaware Valley Friends School, which was for learning different students, bright but off the wall. And once again, I was advocating untapped potential because these students had been labeled as stupid, disruptive, unteachable. No, if they could get a handle on their own metacognition, figure out how they learned, which was what we tried to do. They were wonderful, wonderful students. And words form thought. They are learning different. They're not learning disabled. And it was just great fun and extremely frustrating to find the key to these students. But once you did, it was just so rewarding to see what happened to them. And it was the only time where I felt that I was teaching that the kids were learning because of me, not in spite of me. When I was teaching at these wonderful girls' schools, the students were very, very bright. In fact, I used to run behind them and ask Socratic questions and let them figure out the answers. In 1997, I decided to get a divorce. When I told some former clinic staff that I was getting divorced, they said, "Your daughter has been asking us for years how in the world I could be in a relationship that was holding me back and advocate women." I mean, it was an oxymoron. So it was a good question, and later I gave the answer to a man who nailed me at a cocktail party. He said, "How dare you do this to your husband?" And I said, "I stayed in the marriage for 31 years because I took my vows seriously, and I left because I think it's ungodly to stay in a relationship where neither one grows." So now, single by choice, I wanted to travel to developing countries and live among the people, and that's where Habitat for Humanity came into play. The first time I was a team member, I went to Nepal, and I just loved it. And the team kept saying, "Oh, you'd make a good leader." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I'm always a leader. It's fun to be a follower." And then I thought, no, wait a minute. If I'm the leader, I can choose who's going on the trip, where we're going, when we're going. Why wouldn't I want to be a leader? And so I have led to 12 nations: Australia, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Jordan, Kyrgyzstan, and 6 times to my beloved Africa. And Mongolia is the next in September, and I have 2 places open. So anybody want to come? My first lead was to Kenya, and the village was very poor with very few resources. And I learned that many of the adults had AIDS, and I thought, oh my Lord, I'm wearing the wrong hat. I should be handing out birth control. But I talked to a woman who got the first Habitat house, and she was a nurse who had spent an inordinate amount of her salary to live in an apartment with electricity. When she heard she could be a homeowner of a Habitat house that had no electricity or no running water, but she would be in the driver's seat, she became the first woman. And it's once again empowerment. This woman started a little kiosk and started a domestic abuse circle. And I've seen it happen so many times where these families suddenly aren't worried about leaky roofs and mud walls during the rainy season. They're able to get their children in school, and you can see a visible lightness in their footsteps. It's wonderful. And again, it empowers my team members. I've had many team members who've found this time a time to reflect on who they are and what they want to do. And recently I had two guys, one from Microsoft and one from Google. Both of them threw over their jobs and have gotten involved in the nonprofit sector. And many, many of them have become team leaders, so I've inadvertently mentored them. So now I'm deeply involved in this school in Tanzania for vulnerable girls. They have had to drop out of primary school from lack of money, sickness in the family, AIDS, and we tutor them for a year so they can pass the exam to get into secondary school, because that's what we are. And they have an 85% pass rate instead of a 50% pass rate. And we all know, educating a woman, you educate a village. So I didn't seek a career that caused empowerment, but in retrospect, empowerment has been the connector. I'd be glad to answer any questions. Martha? Well, if I were a leader for the Smithsonian, the question is, what do I look for when I'm looking for team members for my Habitat trips? And the reason I love being a leader for Habitat is I can choose my members. If I were a leader for Smithsonian, as long as you don't have a police record and have the money, you're on the group. So I'm looking for a sense of humor, a sense of tolerance, and flexibility. And if I get those three qualities, I've got a good team member. You don't need to have any construction skill sets, because Habitat families have to put in 50% sweat equity themselves. So their contractors are used to teaching people how to build a house. And so you learn on the job.
Okay. Shirley, how many is on a team?
I take a big team. I usually take 12 to 16 because I'm always afraid I'll pick a rotten apple, and I'd rather pass a rotten apple around 12 or 16 people than around 8. Alice?
How do you screen for flexibility?
Okay, well, I talk to everybody for about 45 minutes on the phone, and I have 15 questions. I always ask the same 15 questions, so I can perhaps judge apples and oranges. And the headquarters always say to the leaders, well, you know, after you've talked, say, well, now you think about it for a few days, and I'll get back to you. I always know within minutes whether this person's the right person or not, so I always offer them the position right away. I paint a very gray picture. I say, you know, we're going to be living with the use of an outhouse. There's not going to be any hot water. There are going to be tarantulas, and you know, if I can see that I'm talking to a princess, I realize she's not going to do well on this trip. And I don't know, and I think even more, sense of humor is so important because in developing countries, things don't happen the way you think they're going to happen. I kind of like it when they don't go, because that's when the fun begins. You have to kind of shoot from the hip, and who knows what's going to turn up. I remember in Tanzania, we were taking 3 trucks on safari afterwards, and one of the truck's axles just fell onto the ground. And so we hauled the truck over to the side of the road. We unloaded it, and of course we're always carrying just cases of water. The one thing I want to do is keep my team healthy and make sure that they're drinking, hydrated, and that the water is good. So everyone sat on piles of cases of water and fit it into the 2 trucks, and we drove off, and that was it. So, does that answer your question, Alice? I'm not sure it does.
I've never submitted myself.
Yes.
I was a donor to Habitat, and then I started getting a lot of requests for money from religious organizations, and when I asked them how they got my name, it was from Habitat.
Well,
so what's the connection between Habitat and religion?
Oh, that's a good question, and one I always ask. The question was that Irene has been involved with Habitat and then seems to get on the mailing lists of many religious organizations, and she's been able to trace it back to Habitat. And I think that's very bizarre, because Habitat is ecumenical. It was started by a right-wing Christian, and my first trip to Kenya, I took this young couple that was very right-wing, and they were furious at me for not, praying and saying Jesus Christ. I say the only time I say Jesus Christ is when I stub my toe. If I had the perfect trip, I'd have an agnostic, an atheist, a Jew, a Catholic, a Christian, a Muslim, a Buddhist. It would make for a very fascinating group. And part of my what I look for in a team is diversity. I want age diversity. My trip to Mongolia, I have from 18 to 71 and every decade represented, and that's usually the case. I want geographical diversity. I have a 18-year-old from Singapore, and somebody from Canada, and from 8 or 9 states in the United States, and I just think that we're going to be, haunch to haunch for 2 weeks. We better be interesting among ourselves, or else it's not going to be a very interesting trip. So So when I went back to Habitat, I kind of went creeping back to Habitat and said, you've really got the wrong leader, because I am a religious mutt. And that's a quote from Tuesdays with Maury. And they said, no, we are ecumenical. This group didn't know. So I don't know how that happened. Yeah. Yes?
How does it look like in Tanzania?
This is really the fun thing. If you're ever driving by Americus, Georgia, stop, because they have a museum of all the houses that they build all over the world. So you can see the kind of houses we build in Tanzania, because they listen to the people and what they want, and they build what they want. In Mozambique, I was building houses for grandmothers who were raising the children because the parents had died of AIDS. And we built rondavals, the little wonderful little round reed construction walls and the straw roofs. I mean, they were just wonderful and very easy to build. We built 18 in 10 days. Because what we did was we put them on a cement slab and 2 traces of cement to be high enough so the mud wouldn't splash away. And we asked them before we started building, not me, but before them, wouldn't you like a window? Absolutely not. That their house was their castle and their fortress, and they didn't want to have to watch anything more than their door. They didn't want to have to worry about a window. And so all the houses are very different. In Kyrgyzstan, they're made out of mud and straw. And then the last thing is a coating of plaster, which is, what we usually would put up a wire mesh sort of thing. Well, labor is cheap and material is expensive. We put up a wire mesh by hand Every 6 inches we put in a nail, and then we took a piece of wire and dig it. Well, they hadn't figured out a system, and I immediately thought, this is a drag. Let's get a long stick, mark it every 6 months, hang it up, make a mark, and we'll do it much faster. As a matter of fact, this happens all the time. I get my, you can see I'm high energy, and I seem to draw high energy team members. And I used to not pay much attention to the fact that we always ran out of work, even though I begged for them to have enough work. Well, the first day in Kyrgyzstan, my counterpart came up to me after the first day and said, "Oh, Sherley, I hate to disappoint you, but you've buzzed through the first 3 days of work already. We're not going to have enough to do." I said, "Oh boy, you see that mountain? We're going to climb it. You see that lake? We're going to swim it. See those yurts? We're going to figure out how they're built. We'll work from 8 to 2, and we'll have the afternoon off." And that's what we did. And that happens in Africa. They always say, "Oh, now we'll start at 8 and we'll go to 12. We'll take a 2-hour lunch, and then we'll work from 2 to 4. And by that time, we'll be 120 degrees." So the first day we do that, and we're all just wilting when it's the first day. So I go up and say, "Now look, just humor me, and for one day, let us start working at 6 o'clock, and we'll work from 6 to 12. And then we'll have the lunch and have the afternoon off." And most places, they're willing to do it, and they love it because we have so much energy in the cool of the morning that we get through a lot more work. So, another question? Yeah?
One more. I love your theme of empowerment, and what I'm noticing now is a lot of young girls aren't as protective of their rights as we were, because some of us had to fight a little harder for them, and many of them don't think there's, it's just like nothing, and I worry that. Do you have any words of wisdom for young women about protecting their ability to empower themselves and their daughters?
Are you talking about women, young women in
the U.S.?
In the U.S. that I need more?
Aren't afraid that they could lose the freedom to choose.
Oh, tell me about it. I know. Well, a couple things. One about, oh, excuse me. The question is, the women graduating today don't remember the bad old days of abortion, where the doctor, one of the reasons my doctor wanted to start a clinic is that he remembers when he was an intern having to go time and time again and tell the family that their mother had died because of a septic abortion. So the doctors don't remember the bad old days. The women don't remember the bad old days. And I was naive enough when I started the clinic to think I could educate myself out of existence, just, explain about birth control. Then I realized human nature, we're all risk takers. We do things spontaneously, especially in the moment of passion, and that birth control will lessen the number, but there will always be a need for a safety net, and that's what abortion is for. And that to put the restrictions that are being suggested now is just to make it go underground. Women are going to seek abortions, and if they can't get it accessible and affordable and clean, they're going to take risks to not continue their family. One of the women that I worked with for years was, her mother had died in a septic abortion, and she was one of 6, and her father was overwhelmed and farmed out the children hither and yon to be raised, and she remembers that. My concern is in developing countries, I try very hard to tell my group, one, to always go in groups of 1 or 2. When we were in Jordan recently, luckily last October, we were in the northern part of Jordan, which is quite conservative. It was 110 by 11, and we had to wear long pants and long shirt sleeves. It was hot. But I think that it's naive of us to assume that women are perceived the same way worldwide, and that it is very important that I do my best to explain the mores. I keep saying in Africa, legs are sexy, boobs are utilitarian. And it's really true. I mean, you see African women nursing their babies, you know, with bare breasts, but legs are the ally to something more suggestive, and so legs are to be covered at all times, and preferably long skirts. I lived with a Maasai couple, not with the Habitat group, but another time, and the woman was really disappointed that I only had one long skirt, so she loaned me a couple more because she just felt it was much more calmly for me to be in a long skirt than in long pants. Well, thank you for listening to me.